was married for almost 10 years to my best friend, somebody who I thought we were going to grow old, have kids, all of that. And I had my life all figured out. But on August 6, 2003, I got a call that literally changed the trajectory of my life.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I'd like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we've got on another brilliant guest. This is Kim Witczak, and she is a drug safety advocate and speaker. Welcome to the show, Kim. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Zuby.
Awesome. I've done a very brief intro there, Kim, but for my listeners who are not familiar with you and your work, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, I like to call myself an accidental advocate. I do a lot of drug safety, pharmaceutical work after the death of my husband 21 years ago. I also still spend half my day in advertising as a producer, as well as for many years, I just finished my term as FDA Psychopharmacologic Drugs Advisory Committee consumer rep, which means I get to see how drugs come onto market here in the US and how it really has an impact for the greater, the impact on the greater world. So anyways, I'm really thrilled to have it. I have a lot of different aspects. I always say I'm a little popcorn here and there. So I'm excited for the conversation.
Awesome. Kim, tell me a little bit more about your background. I want to know more about you as a person before you got into all of your advocacy work.
Sure. Well, I'm from Minneapolis. It's in the middle of the country of the US. And I have been, I'm a creative. I have spent my entire career in advertising. And I love being around creative people and having conversations. I'm an artist as well. And obviously my husband passed away. I'm not married, but I have a lot of family and friends and nieces and nephew. I feel like through probably one of the hardest points of my life, and I know we'll get into it, I feel more alive today than I ever did before. So that's a little bit about me. Like I said, never wanted or would have chose to do the advocacy work that I have done now for 21 years. But I think it all does kind of come together in my background and the experiences I've had, and have helped start other nonprofits before I actually did my drug safety work. I helped start a program in Minnesota working with kids that have been abused, neglected, at risk, using the power of art and giving them a voice. And so that's really, that has been my passion before I got thrown into this drug safety work.
Awesome. And I'm sure you've told this story, what must be countless times, but you touched on it briefly about the death of your husband 21 years ago. But what was it that happened that got you into this work?
Sure. Well, I was married for almost 10 years to my best friend, somebody who I thought we were going to grow old, have kids, all of that. And I had my life all figured out. But on August 6, 2003, I got a call that literally changed the trajectory of my life. I hadn't heard from my husband all day, and I was out of town on business. And so I asked my dad, do me a favor, go check and see if my husband, if Woody was there. He was having trouble sleeping. So I was afraid, I thought maybe he hit his head. All of a sudden, my dad calls me at 9:00 at night. We're still shooting. And he's like, it's bad. It's bad. And I'm like, what do you mean it's bad? And he's like, Woody's dead. I'm like, what do you mean Woody's dead? Like, what? And he goes, I go, how do you know he's dead? He goes, he's hanging. I'm like, what? And so literally, like, Woody wasn't depressed. Woody had no history of depression. And so, like, literally that word of, like, he's dead, he's hanging, it made absolutely no sense. But 5 weeks earlier, Woody had just started his dream job with a startup company and was having trouble sleeping. And he went into his doctor and the doctor had given him the samples of an antidepressant, Zoloft, and told him it would help him take the edge off and help him sleep. And so Woody, was a guy who just trusted the doctors. They always fixed him. He was a big athlete. So they always fixed him up. They stitched him up. He had a broken bone. So he trusted his doctor. And I happened to be out of the country the first 3 weeks Woody was on the drug. And I come home, and I'll never, because it was our busy time of work. But anyways, I'll never forget when I came home, Woody walked through the back door and he fell to the floor, and he was completely drenched in sweat, and his hands around his head like a vice. Kim, you got to help me. I don't know what's happening to me. My head's outside my body. Look at him. You got to help me. And so we calmed him down, and he called his doctor, and the doctor said, you got to give the drug 4 to 6 weeks to kick in. And every night the next week of Woody's life, he'd be like, what do you think about acupuncture? What do you think about hypnosis? Everything to beat this feeling from his outside his head. So the night that Woody died and I got that call, that whole conversation, everything came flooding back. But the coroner literally got on the phone that night and asked me one simple question: was Woody taking any medication? And the only medication Woody was taking was Zoloft. And she said, proceeded to say she's going to take it with her because it might have something to do with his death. And so that became clue number one. And the second clue was the front page of our newspaper, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, had an article that said the UK finds link between antidepressants and suicide in teens. And so at that moment, my life had fallen apart, but I had no idea that those seeds were being planted for what eventually became my advocacy. Because like I said, Woody had no history of depression. He didn't get it for depression. There were no warnings. And so that became our mission, is to get black box suicide warnings added to antidepressants.
Wow. Well, first thing, of course, is my condolences. It doesn't matter that it's 21 years past. Just hearing that story, it's harrowing, and I can only, I can't even imagine just what that must have been like. And yeah, and it must still be, I know it must still be difficult. So my heart goes out to you and my condolences. Following on from that, what was trying to think of the best way to word the question. What was the next step after grieving? Once you thought that there was perhaps some type of link between this medication he was taking and what happened, how did you proceed with that?
Well, interesting. I think, grief is one of those things. This was part of my grieving process, right? But I'll never forget, right shortly after Woody's funeral, we had a bunch of posters, life-size posters in the basement. And I remember sitting on the floor, just crying, going, God, use my pain and take my pain and use it. It does me no good. So for anybody who's ever had heart pain, or loss or grief, I mean, heartache is real pain. I was trying to scratch it out. So anyways, that prayer was happening. My brother-in-law goes home and Googles Zoloft and suicide. Had no idea that in 1991, the FDA held hearings on the emergence of violence and suicide with Prozac. And so almost I'm not kidding, almost within months, we ended up going to get on planes and heading out to DC and meeting with our representatives. We met with some of the top officials at the FDA, and we told Woody's story. And I also had a huge lawsuit against Pfizer, where we got a lot of documents out from under seal that showed that the FDA, Pfizer, and other drug companies have long been aware of the risk of suicide and violence with these medications. So that was our initial step. And Woody's story, because it became almost like a poster child, because he had no history of depression. And so he was given it off label for insomnia. And so if you can make somebody like this do something and kill himself, what does it do when people are actually, are depressed? Does it, and, everybody thinks that the suicide is just a kid risk. It's not. So in 2004, we got the antidepressant or the suicide black box warnings for kids to 18. 2006, we helped to get it increased to age 24. But to this day, all ages are at risk, but the warnings stop at 24. And these drugs don't know the difference if you're 24 today, 25 tomorrow. All the documents that came out, Pfizer has known that this risk, the FDA has known about this risk. So even though Woody's story is 21 years ago, it is as relevant today, if not more so, because our growing global mental health crisis and the use of and the rising number of antidepressants prescriptions and other medications, because there's a bunch of other ones that are now coming on market for treatment resistant depression. So it's a big deal. And at the end of the day, when I started learning all this information about these medications, I had to do something, because it was too late for our family. But if I could do anything and use my voice to make sure that what we didn't know, because we were completely blindsided, and I had to do something. And so that has been why I call myself the accidental advocate, and kind of threw myself into the fight that happens out in DC, because trust me, it is not a pretty place out there, when you're fighting all the big institutions, etc. But the voice of the harmed is really, really important. And I think for so long, the voice of the other side, those who have been harmed or killed, or of any of the medication treatments, has always been like kind of silenced or gaslit. And harms tend to happen one-off, so one at a time, and people don't connect the dots. But, when you start connecting the dots, you're like, whoa, this is a big, big story that we have not been talking about or haven't been told about around the world, but especially in the US.
If you're a fan of dystopian fiction and sci-fi thrillers, then you should check out Lucid, a new novel by writer Michael S. Milano. Lucid is a 21st century blend of 1984 and Brave New World, set during a devastating pandemic. The year is 2084, and the Pharmaceutical Corporation protects what's left of humanity from the deadly Timbuktu virus and a terrorist organization known as Praxis. After losing his wife to the pandemic and being assaulted by public safety for violating curfew, citizen Anthony Sartori begins to have bizarre flashbacks. In a culture dominated by suspicion, asking the wrong questions could put him in the crosshairs, but Anthony is determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. Lucid is an exciting and timely read that cautions against collectivism, technological surveillance, and sacrificing freedom for the illusion of safety. If that's up your alley, go to lucidthebook.com and grab yourself a copy today. That's LUCID, thebook.com, to get yourself a copy. Free to be safe, safe to be free. lucidthebook.com. Do you know how many similar stories there have been from these drugs? Do you have any data on that?
Well, there's thousands and thousands of people that are killed every day. They say that the deaths from psychiatric drugs can be in the second, third cause of death behind, heart disease from properly prescribed medications, pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of deaths. I can get you the actual numbers or what they think. But, for so long, I think people have always said when there's a death from these medications, they'll blame the victim, like, oh, they were depressed. And so all you really just go and look at, they say, well, the side effect that Woody actually had, or what they call is akathisia, which is a it's that like constantly like scratching it. It's an internal agitation. You want it to get out of your body. It's a head outside the body. Pfizer's own chief medical officer said that if a patient gets akathisia, quote unquote, death can be a welcome result. And I think, and they intentionally kept akathisia from our GPs, our doctors, and that was one of the documents that came out from under seal. It showed that they said it was not suitable for general practitioners, which is where a majority of these drugs are written. So that is one of the things, and why I keep talking is they anywhere from like 3 to 5%, they say, of people can get akathisia. Obviously, not all those people go on to take their lives. However, when you start looking at the sheer number of people who take antidepressants around the world, it's a big potential risk, and it's why we need to be warned about potential for side effects.
So, what is the status of these drugs now? What has changed from 2003 to 2024? You can narrow that to just within the USA if that's useful.
Well, I would say number one, we have in 2003 when Woody died, there were no warnings. So we have warnings now in 2004, 2006. However, the prevalence of the prescription rates has skyrocketed. They say 1 in 4 adults, 1 in 12 kids are on these medications in the US. And so there are a lot of, and just the mental health crisis keeps growing. And it doesn't seem like it's actually doing a whole lot of help, because we're just throwing pills at people as opposed to like, are there solutions? So I think that conversation has been happening. And so I'm glad to see it. However, I do think with the new administration and the focus on Make America Healthy Again, the MAHA commission, that this administration has put a focus on studying the prevalence of these medications in the growing mental health crisis. So I have been praying for this moment, that we would be looking at this idea of, on a really large scale, are these medications actually helping, or are they hurting? And so I'm really happy to see this being one of the greatest opportunities, as well as to this day. If I go back and look at in 91, when the FDA advisory board looked at the emergence of violence, we have never in this country studied the potential for the role psychiatric drugs may or may not play in shootings and mass shootings. So I think that's another huge opportunity that I see a push for in today's 2025 world.
Well, it seems obvious that there is a correlation. Causation, I don't know, but it's clear. I mean, it's clear to a layman. I don't know what percentage of people who commit these acts like mass shootings and things like that, I don't know what percentage are on some type of psychotropic drug, but I believe it's the majority. It's clearly most. Now, someone could say that, oh, well, obviously you need to have mental health issues to even go and do that type of horrific act. Or someone might say, well, if someone's going to commit suicide or even have suicidal ideation, there's obviously something already going wrong with them mentally. So perhaps it might be difficult to know the difference between the correlation and causation on that front. But very clearly there's correlation. And it looks like the drug companies themselves, with these warnings, have accepted that in some people there is a causation, because if suicidal ideation or increased depression is a known side effect of a drug which ironically is supposed to help prevent or reduce depression, I mean, there's very clearly a link. So why do you think those studies have not been done?
Well, it's interesting. So I always say violence against, there's suicide is actually violence against yourself, right?
Mhm.
So, and violence, they haven't studied it. And I think, well, and it's interesting. One of the other documents that a couple other documents that came out from under seal is why in the late 90s did Pfizer help to create a prosecutor manual for Zoloft? And that was the Zoloft defense when their crimes were committed. So, and then there were also documents in Pfizer's files that said, I don't think fluoxetine, which is the chemical name for Prozac, is out of their woods with their association with violence. And so, I think the violence piece is actually, that's a pretty scary thing because we're all, truthfully, when you think about it, like some of those mass shootings that have happened, whether it's schools or it's been a movie theater, we could all potentially be at sitting ducks. And it's why it's really important that we push for these. And I think there's a lot of money that is going between the mental health institutions, the middle people, the behavior organizations, they're all like their strategy, or one of the strategies is the pills, right? So they're not going to, they're taking away one of their tools. They're certainly not going to say, oh, it might be or associated with. I think if there's a political component, which is, in our country, it's the whole thing with the guns, and guns are super, that's a low hanging fruit. Of course, we need to look at it, but if we don't even consider it, and then, I've always said that every time there is a shooting, we should be able, the public deserves to know if they were on any medications. But I guess what I have been told is that I think they probably could ask, just like that coroner asked me. And I think that was just an innocent question, was would he taken any medications? The people that go in and investigate can easily ask for their medications so that we can at least have context. Again, doesn't mean causation, but is there a correlation? Is there a link? We need to have that conversation because we are all at risk. And it's interesting. There were some high profile here in this country. There was the West Becker case, and it was, I believe it was Paxil, where this gentleman killed his family and then turned it on himself. And there were settlements between the drug companies so that a lot of this didn't come out into the public. So I think it's time. I think we have come to, a boiling point where we just can't ignore these things because something clearly is not working. Because if we've had now the advent of these SSRIs or the NRIs, which are the new antidepressants for all these years, and our crisis is still going up, I think it is a time that we have to take a pause and relook at them.
In the past 34 years, have any of these drugs been withdrawn? Have any of these pharmaceutical companies faced any sort of consequences or penalties? What has transpired over those last several decades, which are the majority of my life? What's actually changed? What's gone on?
Well, not a whole, in terms on the violence piece, not a whole lot, right? Not a whole lot. Now, on there have been lawsuits, obviously for suicides. That has been one thing. The suicides that helped to drive warnings. There has also been lawsuits, major lawsuits to do with withdrawal, because that's another thing that people have not been told about, how difficult these drugs are to get off of them. So that is one thing that has been out there. However, to this day, all these drugs are still on the market. Nothing's been withdrawn. I would like to at least mention there's another drug. It's not an antidepressant, but they use it to help people get off the smoking. It's a Pfizer drug, Chantix. And that did have, when it came on the market, it had no warnings. And then eventually they had some strong warnings because there was a lot of violence associated and neuropsychiatric side effects associated with that drug. And they eventually the FDA put warnings on because of lawsuits. Then once those lawsuits were all settled, like 2,800 lawsuits, Pfizer made sure that those victims never could tell their stories again in public. They went back to the FDA and asked to have that warning removed. And so,
Oh, wow.
yeah, and that happened. And I was on the committee that was going to look at this, the FDA committee, the same way that at 91 didn't do their job. I now had a position on that committee. And I got kicked off from that committee for that particular meeting for an intellectual bias, which just means I knew about the safety part of things, and I'll always have safety as one of my big concerns. And because I wanted to know where were all the victims, because I want to hear from them. I want to hear from the experts that were inside the drug company files and saw the documents that they said are probably some of the most egregious public health documents that belong out to our, out in the public. And so what I've seen through this whole process, it's a lot of money to protect profits, not really to protect you and I, the patient. And so it really comes around to us and, people like you that are giving people like me a platform to be telling these so that the average person has some information to question, because, we need at the base of everything informed consent. And informed consent means that if you're going to take these drugs or you're going to give them to your kids, you should know the background on them.
When it comes to these giant pharmaceutical companies, particularly with I'm not American, and I'm always trying to understand some of the way these mechanisms work in the US, because it seems to be particularly egregious in that nation. I think the US is 4% of the globe's population, and they consume like 70, 80, 90% of certain drug categories. So the rates of prescription and the rates of just drug use in general, illegal and legal in the USA, are just insane. Like, it's crazy. And I think increasingly, I think more and more Americans are working out that this is not normal and that this is not a global standard. I think for a long time, even from conversations I've had with American friends, they've kind of run under the assumption that, oh, it's like this everywhere. This is just kind of how it is. And I'm like, no, it's really not. Like, this is a particularly egregious issue in your country. Like, these numbers are not normal. The rate of drug overdoses in the USA compared to the UK, for example, this is keeping in account the population. It's about 5x the number of overdose deaths, 5 times the rate in the USA compared to the UK. And that in itself, a 400% difference, that's very significant. Is it just a matter of the money and the lobbying? Is that why these companies are able to get away with this? Because if I think of other companies that make products, we have so many thousands, millions of companies make products. There are phone manufacturers, there's car manufacturers, toy manufacturers, products we use all day, every day. The people who made this camera that I'm looking into, the people who made this computer I'm working from, who made this microphone, all of this. Like, if these products were catching fire randomly or exploding or hurting people in some way, shape, or form, even if it was like 0.01% of this happening, there would be a recall. There would be massive financial penalties. I remember when Samsung, maybe about 10 or 12 years ago at this point, I remember they put out a particular phone, and like a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a percentage of them were catching fire when they were being charged. And they had to recall the entire thing. Like, that entire phone, like, ended up flopping and disappearing. It was like a huge scandal because like 0.0001% of them or something like that had this issue. And when we're talking pharmaceutical, certain drugs, the effects of the rates of serious side effects are much, much higher than fractions of a percentage. Yet it always seems that when it comes to that particular industry, they're just allowed to get away with a lot more than anybody else would be able to get away with. I mean, imagine if all the cars, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of cars are in the USA, and if any big motor company, put out a car, and even if there was just some little glitch with the seat belts, or there was a on 0.01% of the cars, the brakes don't work 0.1% of the time or something, like that would be enough for a recall. So I'm still just trying to understand, like, how does big pharma have so much power and immunity, because money is a factor, but they're not the only company that they're not the only companies that have money. But they just seem to get away with it in a way that no one else does.
In the US, I mean, we're one of only two countries that allow drug ads, right? And so I think advertising, we have a culture of quick fix. Like we want a quick fix. We don't, so I think that adds to it for sure. That's why we have, like, in terms of the rates of how many that we have. But, I look back to some of my initial work, and I was shocked that it was the CEO of Merck back in the 70s. He was in an interview who said that we can't sell to healthy, like we can't make a business just selling to sick people, that we need to have a business. He goes, I want to be like Wrigley's gum. I want to be able to sell to everybody. So I think we have this mentality of in America that has been part of it, like cradle to grave. And it's all like part of this. I think we have regulatory capture. I think like the FDA, I've come to believe, is just a hurdle for business. I think it's our health. And I think when you have your health, we've given the whole system is captured. And I remember, it's interesting, where I learned a lot of this is I would go to conferences all over the world that were in other countries. Like there was one in Amsterdam called Selling Sickness, and it was put on by the Dutch government, and I think some nonprofits, and it was really looking at this idea of why like the American system, it was almost all America examples. And there was only a handful of people from the US that were there. And I remember telling the organizers, I'm like, why isn't this conversation happening in the US? Like, why don't you bring it to the US? And they're like, it's not our problem. And so I ended up bringing that conference, and it was probably a little too early because I do believe the world and this is changing a little bit since COVID, but I think that it has changed. But we brought it to the conference here in 2013, where we really look at, I've now created something called the spider web, and it's where the trapping of everything from our education system and how our doctors, like I was shocked to learn that the doctors don't learn how the FDA works. Well, if the academic institutions who are training our physicians are being, are captured by industry because of the grants and how the grant program works. And then you look at ghostwriting and how the medical journals are written by, and I remember like one of the documents that we got from the lawsuit where Pfizer already knew what the outcome was. They already had the journal article written. It was committed to, but they just had to find an author, and it said author TBD. So they had to go find somebody, and that's when I learned about ghostwriting. And then the key opinion leaders. Marketing and money has driven so much of capturing the entire, it's a complex, right? Then you've got the insurance. So I think that is what seems a little bit different than when I look at a lot of my clients that I have in advertising, which are the car and the airlines and fashion brands. And that, I don't think that same capture exists, as well as a kind of a blind trust that's kind of a blind trust that, somebody else, like when we get sick, we want to give our power away. Where I think when you think about a car company and you have the ability to say, I'm not going to buy a Ford, I'm going to go buy a BMW or whatnot. You have a little bit more, you can do your research. And I feel like that's what's missing on the medical side. And at the end of the day, I like to say, and I tell everybody as part of my lectures, and I've been trying to get into med schools to give them that spider web overview. And I say that healthcare is a business and patients are customers. And I say that because until we realize, because they have to have patients as how they go to business, as they need doctors. So they've learned how to capture the entire framework. So I do believe that that's part of it. And I know our incentives, our programs work different than in other countries. Like our Medicare system then has to pay for the drugs that get approved. And even if it's some of the more expensive new drugs that are coming out for Alzheimer's cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we have, if it gets approved, it gets covered, right? So I do think that in the US, we tend to cover everything, right? So like the Medicare system, if it's approved by the FDA, it then gets covered and it also looks at the costs. Like in other countries, they look at the cost benefit structure. We don't. So anyways, I think all of that adds to this extreme overuse of medication, and why my numbers I use is 5% of the world's population, and we take 75% of all meds. So I think it's big business, and hopefully, I'm not sure. And then you look at the outcomes, right? Let's just look at the outcomes of Americans compared to other parts of the world. You guys are probably in a much better place than we are. And so I'm again going back to looking at the health of our kids and the Americans. So I'm happy to see this new Make America Healthy Commission looking at this.
Yeah, and you've touched on that a few times. What do you think is going to happen with this new administration? What are you hopeful for?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we know it's a lot of money. We know it's going to be a big nut to crack. It's going to take a lot, but for the first time in my 21 years of going out and working on this is the first time I feel hopeful that we're addressing a systemic, from the food system, the chemicals, and the drugs. And so I feel hopeful that there's the motivation, a once in a lifetime motivation to actually shake things up and to look at it and see what can come out of it.
What do you think would be some big wins for RFK Jr. and the new health committee and this administration? What do you think, if we were to look forward to 2029 or 2030, what do you think would need to happen for you to say, awesome, they did a good job and we made some strong headway?
Well, I would love to, number one, it always gets my advertising industry mad when I say this, but I think we need drug ads off the air. That would be a huge win if we could get something like that done. I think that adds to unnecessary overprescribing. I think if we are able to look at some of the, the people who are working on informed consent, like having informed consent as kind of a standard of practice. Like when we look, I never had kids, so I didn't get really into the vaccine advocacy. But once I started learning, I think about the vaccines and how the way they came to market, or they're protected from, obviously that was the big aha for me during COVID, was learning that the companies were given immunity when I was able to actually hold the company accountable for Woody stuff. But then when I learned that in 1986, we gave all the vaccine manufacturers immunity, so that a win would be if we could reverse that these companies are going to be held accountable, because that's where, if you don't have any legal liability, you saw, here in the States, our sheer number of childhood vaccines is off the charts. So I think we could evaluate that. I would also love to see research, a real initiative that has been done on the link and the prevalence of the role antidepressants and these psychotropics have had on shootings. And I would love to see a stronger emphasis that will come out talking about harms and splitting out. It's really kind of in the weeds at the FDA, but having the same people that approve the drugs are not going to be the same people responsible for safety. Because right now it's the same group of people. And so if this group can do some systematic changes at all the agencies, I think we could have a real potential for a healthier America. And then for the people, I feel like we need to start taking back some of our own sovereignty and realizing that we have to have a stake in it too. And we have the ability to push back. And maybe we have to change how we look at blindly trusting the authorities, because that has gotten us into trouble. It certainly obviously changed my life by blindly trusting without ever questioning.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting what you said there at the end, because I think that's it's such a huge part of the equation. In fact, in my mind, the majority of the equation is the part that falls on individual and familial and communal responsibility, especially because of the USA's culture and attitude towards politics, because the USA is so focused on freedom and liberty and the sort of concept of individual autonomy, ability to make one's own choices, all that kind of stuff. Um, People like to think that's all upside. It's not all upside. Some of the cons do include the fact, for example, that these big pharma companies are legally allowed to um, advertise prescription drugs directly to potential consumers. There are people who would fight and say that, well, that's an aspect of liberty, that's an aspect of free speech, and they should be free to do that. So there's ways that it can sort of backfire on people in some ways. But strangely enough, despite that independent attitude, I do think that people have outsourced far too much of their power and their responsibility to the authorities. One of my concerns is that even if, let's say that the Maha movement, and from the administration perspective, from the governmental perspective, they were able to actually get rid of some of the obviously harmful ingredients, maybe even ban some of the or severely restrict some of these prescription drug ads, rein in some of the stuff, rein in some of the excesses. People still need to change how they make their decisions. People still need to change their lifestyles. People still need to choose to eat the right foods and need to choose to exercise and actually look after their bodies, because the options are already there. There are millions of Americans who are in excellent shape. There are millions of Americans who are in terrible shape. That's true in all different countries. It's not like under the current system it's impossible to be healthy or something like that. Sure, there's things that could make it easier, but I don't know. I kind of worry that and I'm not even trying to get out over my skis here. I kind of worry sometimes that people are putting like all of their hope and all of their trust and all of their power with the authorities and with the administrations and with all these big organizations and so on, and they're not thinking enough about the part of like, wait, hang on, even if this stuff all stayed corrupted, I actually have the power to change my decision making now and make better decisions and take my health into my own hands, rather than wanting to continually outsource my own health and my family's health to the authorities. So almost like that's what's been being done for the past few decades, and people want to do it now kind of in another direction, hopeful that they're going to fix everything. And I want them to fix some stuff, but I just think people need to remember that they can't, there's no government, there's no politician that can do this all for you. You see what I mean?
Absolutely. I say all the time, no one will ever care more about you or your family's health than you. And that is
Yes.
the attitude that we all have to take. I mean, yes, as much as I'm putting like hope in the administration to be able to make some changes because we haven't been able to do this, or the first time
Hmm.
I've been, in this work, I, at the end of the day, still know, guess what? I get to decide, and we have to put that power back to us. Like, I get to make the decisions for my family, but I think we, especially Americans, have been trained to trust the white coat and
Mm.
trust government and trust that all the authorities have our best interests at heart. And I think that's what we've noticed is they actually don't. And again, no one's going to care more about you and what you put in your body or your kid's body than you will care. You're the one that gets to make the ultimate choice. And it's also, we have to have the information to help people because not everybody does have that information. And so I think there has to be a curiosity as well. But I would love to, you're absolutely right. I don't think that if we're thinking that, this administration and Maha movement's going to, make it better. I think there's places that can make it better. But at the end of the day, it's up to you and I as individuals to never forget that the power lies within.
Yeah, absolutely. They have the power potentially to make, as you said, systemic changes because the average person doesn't have access to the FDA or big pharmaceutical companies or big food companies. So that whole web of regulations and subsidies and lobbying and all that, that's a deep web where, yeah, I do think it's got to be government officials that handle the majority of that. Um, at the same time, I saw, I think quite recently that was there a certain food dye that they said that they were going to ban? I don't know if it was Red 40 or one of those.
Red, I think it was one of the that's banned in other
Yeah,
countries, but it hasn't been banned here. I mean, that's
yeah.
amazing. Because I'm so glad that there are people like me that are in the food side of things that
Mm.
understand all of this and have been fighting for that as well. Because that's absolutely crazy that in our country it was still in our foods.
Oh yeah, oh, there's tons of those ingredients. There's tons of stuff that's illegal across Europe, but it's allowed in the States. Again, and it should, I don't know. It's such a weird one for me because on one hand, I see people sort of celebrating that and I get it. But then I'm also kind of like removing a dodgy food dye from like Fruit Loops isn't gonna isn't gonna move the needle, right? Like you shouldn't be giving your kids Fruit Loops, right? Like every morning and then sending them off to school to begin with, right? Whether it has that dye in it or not, like that's not that's just not a nutritious breakfast, right? They're still gonna get fat. It's still way too much sugar, and I'm sure they're still eating a lot of garbage around it. So it's like a little Pyrrhic victory maybe, but I'm kind of like, yeah, there needs to be much bigger.
No, I totally agree. Because at the end of the day, like taking I mean, what it goes back to going upriver, right? Like I love that analogy of like, you're always everybody's downriver pulling out the baby, and trying to save the babies that are coming in, but nobody's going upriver. Who's throwing the babies? So this is an
Yeah.
upriver. You know what I mean? Like who's putting the babies in the water? Like let's go upstream and actually like how do we change this? Is it going to be education? Is it about like because if people don't know and they're like, and everything's telling you and it's easy and you're just gonna like it's way easier to go buy a box of Fruit Loops than to, do eggs and or whatever protein and think about it. And so we have to like there's a lot of things, even just education, like how to help people make better decisions on what they're putting, and but there's so many things, but at the end of the day, I mean, we have to be the ones, nobody's forcing you to put Fruit Loops in your kid's body, right?
No.
No one's forcing you to take a medicine. Like, so I always think back to even like right after Woody died, the doctor asked me, I mean, granted, my whole life just fell apart, like blew up. And so I had to question everything that I've ever believed in. So maybe that was the gift that came out of it, right? But she asked me if I needed something to help me with my grief. And I remember looking at her going, wait a minute, I think it's what killed him. But even though she didn't believe that, but she goes, and I go, but aren't I supposed to hurt? Like my husband died. And she goes, well, you don't need to. And I thought, well, yeah, I mean, I would love to not hurt, but it's hard.
This was your doctor, you said?
Yeah, this was my doctor. And so
Okay,
I
that's
think,
scary.
and that is scary, but that's where I'm like, no, there was my, like, if I had been, and trust me, I didn't want to hurt. Like, I'd much rather get rid of this pain, right? But that pill doesn't take away the pain. I still got to do the hard work. I still got to look in the mirror. I got to still face how to, like, reshape my life. That pill's not going to do it for me. And so I think we have got to, that choice was my choice, right? Even though the doctor gave me an easy choice, I had to be the one that said, I don't want to go that route.
I think you've touched on something very deep there, I think, on multiple levels. And one of them is that, when it comes to this whole thing that people call the mental health crisis, something that strikes me is what is going on in the Western modern world is what I call pathologizing the human condition. And what you just said is a great example of it, right? So things that are supposed to be normal emotions or feelings or ways that we react in response to things happening in our lives. It's all being pathologized. And then once it's pathologized, people want to treat it with pills and medicines and prescription drugs rather than healthy, non-pharmaceutical ways of dealing with it, right? So a lot of sadness is being labeled depression. A lot of worry and stress is being labeled anxiety. Going through a heartbreak or something sad is being labeled PTSD. All of this therapy language is slipping in, right? So if somebody who you love and care about passes away, you're supposed to feel sad. You're supposed to feel grief. Perhaps if they're extremely close to you, you're supposed to feel quote unquote depressed for some time. Like that is completely normal. That's a normal human response that has been normal for thousands and thousands of years. And in the past, nobody would have even thought of the idea, oh no, this poor woman has just become a widow, or these poor parents have just lost their child, or this man has just lost his brother. We need to give him some sort of drug. It's just like, it's such a crazy line of thinking to me. And this expands to so many other things. Even if we look at something like obesity, you look at something like type 2 diabetes, right? It's just, oh, what pill or intervention or pharmaceutical. It's like, wait, what about, let's look at the diet. Let's look, what's this person eating? How are they sleeping? What's their lifestyle? Are they even exercising? Do they even go outside? Are they getting enough sunlight? What are their relationships like? Are they working a job that they absolutely hate and can't stand? Have they gone through something recent which is making them feel particularly upset? It's just, oh no, here's a Band-Aid for that one. Here's a Band-Aid for that one. Here's a Band-Aid for that one, instead of actually getting to the root, like you said, going upstream and seeing what's going on. And I'm far from an expert in this topic, but it just seems so obvious to me as someone who, I would like to believe thinks clearly and has common sense, that this is what's just going on all sorts of different levels. Yes, I'm sure there are some situations, there are some conditions that people can have where, sadly, some sort of pharmaceutical intervention is needed for them to be able to just function on a basic level, at least for some time. But it's not at the rate that these things are being prescribed. Like when you say like 20%, 25% of adults being on some sort of, psychoactive drug, like that's not normal. You don't have a quarter of the population who has like some sort of genuine mental illness or mental health condition. Like that's just not, that just doesn't track with reality. It doesn't track with history, and it doesn't track with the rest of the world.
100. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I look at the whole system that we have, which is the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that keeps adding in these, like
Mm.
conditions. And I remember even when I went to, and that's for like insurance billing, whatever, it's just human stuff. And I remember my grief counselor, she wrote down that I had, I think it was called something disorder, adjustment disorder. And I about had her head off. I'm like, I do not have a disorder. Like, don't even put that word in my brain. Like, I do not have a
Mm.
disorder. My husband died. I'm talking to you because, and she was like, well, we have to put a code down. And I was like, a adjustment disorder, right? And so I was super offended. And I think that we need to also like push back on some of these systems, and because
Oh
that
yeah.
is like a normal response. And I also think about like, you said common sense, which is one of the words that I always think about, that I feel really lucky that I was raised in a family of common sense, that you didn't, pills weren't the route that we went. You just, they were farmers, like, even though I didn't grow up on a farm, they just, common sense was kind of ingrained. And so common sense is like, well, wait, like humans were here a long time. Like, you go through the Bible and you just look at the Bible in itself and stories. They talk about depression, they talk about anxiety, they talk about, because they're human conditions. And I will never forget. And sometimes I think we have to reframe how we even look at some of these things, that maybe this is our greatest opportunity as a human being to actually look at what's not working in our lives, right? Like depression, what is not working? Something may not be working. It's just an opportunity to get curious. And maybe you have to do it with somebody else in this conversation, so you're not alone and out of your head, or, in your head spinning. But, it's an opportunity to have, or if you're anxious, like, why am I anxious? What story am I telling myself? And usually anxiety is about future events, or thinking everything's going to go wrong. But like, what if I switch the script and I say, what could go right? But that's not, as humans, we're kind of not wired that way necessarily. But these are opportunities. And I remember, I work with all these different people that are helping in different ways. And one of them has this organization called Face It, and it's working with men, and using the role of peers to help in, because a lot of times men don't have the same kind of community as women, or they don't feel as comfortable sharing. So this was all targeted at men, and it was his own journey, how he started it. But he told me a story where he got a call to go to the emergency room because one of his people tried to take his own life, and he was on a ton of medications. And he said to him, and the reason to Face It is, he finds out that this guy lost his job 3 months ago and was still never told his wife, and was pretending he was going to work. Well, there,
Mm.
right there is something where, like, here's an opportunity to face it. And we have to also be willing to look at the root causes, because a pill will never take away that. And a pill will never bring back your job that you hated anyways, but it was the job that you were doing, like, or, not going, I have somebody at the gym that I work out at every day. Literally, she was like, she's already lost 105 pounds. I mean, like a person. And she shows up every single day and has not, and does the hard. She goes, it's hard for me to get here. But I said, you are my hero, because you're doing the hard right, not the easy wrong. Like, and I say easy wrong because the quick fix, because
Hmm.
so these are all things that lie within us as people.
Amen. Kim, what is next for you?
So what's next for me? I'm super excited. I'm gonna finally write my book, which is gonna be a little bit about my journey and things that I discovered out in DC, but also my own personal journey of healing and the things that I've done, that have, because through probably one of the worst things in my life, I found my own voice. And so that to me has been something I'm ready to share. I will continue to still do work out in DC because I'm going to use my voice. But for a long time, I've hid behind Woody's voice and telling his story because I've been afraid to tell my own. So I'm learning. So I appreciate you having and allowing me to have some of my conversation about my philosophies of what true healing can look like.
Awesome, Kim. And where can people find and follow you online?
They can find me, well, on X, it's at Woody Matters, and on my name, kimwitczak.com. And as well as I have a Substack on it's acceptable collateral damage, and on Instagram as well, Kim Witczak.
Awesome, Kim. Thanks for coming on the show. Really great to talk to you at last.
So great. Thanks, Zuby, so much.